Ian, thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us today, and welcome to the World Deciphered.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to see you again.
Let's start from a broad question. What's your assessment of Russia's performance in Ukraine, and how does NATO see Russia from the military perspective, whether it's the weakness of Russian military or strength?
You know, when it comes to NATO's assessment, I can't speak for NATO, but I think most NATO analysts, most NATO commanders are not impressed by Russia's military capabilities. What they see is a plotting strategy of military and societal attrition that is nonetheless, because of Russia's advantages in mass, is having a steady effect to Russia's advantage. And we see that particularly in eastern Ukraine, Donbass, where the Russians are throwing soldiers and lives away every day. Some saying 1,000 a day are being lost, Russians being killed, but they're gaining a kilometer or a few hundred yards here and there, but every day. So you can't say the Russians are losing. They're losing a lot of lives, but they're gaining territory. And this is Putin's primary objective, not the protection of his Russian lives, but the attainment of Ukrainian territory. I think a second factor that is a focus of Allied commanders and leaders is that this is a war that highlights and underscores that the world has returned to battlefields that feature high intensity warfare. It's mass rounds of ammunition being expended with high volumes of lives being lost. And maybe a third factor that they've learned or been reminded of is that Russia can be, in this case, is a very determined adversary that has a very different value set. And difference in value set is Putin doesn't care how many lives he loses, just as long as he sees the prospect down the road of territorial gains and ultimate victory.
Let's switch gears to nuclear deterrence. Russia is a nuclear power, of course, and it's emphasizing on nuclear deterrence in its military doctrine. Now, where do you see this nuclear deterrence playing into the war in Ukraine? Do you actually see that Russia is using it as a deterrent, nuclear weapons, that is? Or do you think that there is a real chance that Russia will use nukes at some point?
I'm not sure this war has revealed anything much new about Russia's nuclear warfighting strategy and its tactics. So Putin, he's moved some nuclear weapons, for example, into Belarus, but I haven't heard evidence of him doing anything that has dramatically said that we're on the cusp of a nuclear war. There's been some reports of it, but nothing that changes our understanding of their strategy and tactics of how they actually employ those systems. But when it comes to nuclear coercion, that is different. Nuclear coercion has been a key element of Russia's strategy in the invasion of Ukraine. And it's been particularly prominent during the February 2022 invasion, where Putin preceded that invasion with the launching of ballistic missiles, a verbal warning, and it's been followed by threats of a nuclear war if the West becomes directly involved in this war. And that coercion has had effect. I mean, you know the lines, Ia, no boots on the ground. You've reported regularly on how slow our assistance has flowed to the Ukrainians when it comes down to critical munitions, long-range strike, tanks, air defense systems, and such. So Putin has been able to exercise nuclear coercion with effect. And that, to me, is incredibly worrisome. It has weakened Ukraine's ability or limited Ukraine's ability to respond to this war. Second, it's a message to other countries around the world that nuclear coercion can be exercised with effect. That has a proliferation dynamic, not only among our adversaries who go, oh, my goodness, we can exercise nuclear coercion in the same way. Think of China and Taiwan and its plans for Taiwan. Think about Iran or other potential hegemons who are going, what do I need to do to prevent the West from meddling in my imperial ambitions? It affects the debate over the role of nuclear weapons in our allies. Look at the debate that's going on in South Korea. That's a democracy. That's a close ally. There's a debate over there whether or not they should have nuclear weapons to deter North Korea and China. So the proliferation dimension here. And then there's also a concern that I have about nuclear coercion actually leading to the exercise of nuclear weapons. If you reward nuclear coercion, you will see nuclear coercion exercised again and again. And in fact, that's what we've seen in the course of these last 2.5 years in Ukraine. And I fear that's human nature, that when you constantly repeat a threat, that's what nuclear coercion is, you increase the likelihood you actually exercise that threat.
So you're not excluding the possibility of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think you cannot exclude that. It is a nuclear power, but you can exaggerate that threat, and you can also mismanage that threat, so to speak, when it comes to shaping your strategy to respond to aggression. And I think that's what's going on today. Putin has effectively used nuclear coercion to limit our support to Ukraine, and that has been to Ukraine's disadvantage.
Do you think we're doing enough? Do you think NATO is doing enough? And the United States, of course, to prevent this coercion, as you called it, or saber-rattling, as some experts call it? Is there anything different that the West should be doing in this regard?
I think that what the West should be doing is to increase its support to Ukraine. Demonstrate that the Ukrainians can not demonstrate, but enable the Ukrainians to win, to defeat the Russians, thereby demonstrating that nuclear coercion doesn't have effect. And I think there is room for us to responsibly manage that threat. Think about the imbalance of power that's at play here. We're talking about just the alliance alone, not the other partners in Europe and elsewhere that are supporting Ukraine. But NATO alone has a GDP of $54 trillion. That's compared to Russia's less than $2 trillion, a factor of 25. NATO spends $1.5 trillion this year on defense budgets. Russia, we don't know for sure, somewhere between 100, 120, 130 billion dollars, so a factor of 10. So the alliance is in the position to crush this invasion. And if we provided the Ukrainians the weapons at the rate they need, the type they need, without the restrictions we're placing on them, on their use against legitimate military targets in Russia, that would have effect. If we really amped up our economic sanctions on Russia, that would have effect. Russia is projected to grow by 3.2% this year. That's what it grew GDP-wise last year. If we really stepped up an information campaign, that would help have effect. If we were clear to Putin and also to the Ukrainians that we're going to bring them in to NATO, that they're no longer in a gray zone of ambiguity in Europe that leads Putin to conclude that he can sweep them off the map, place them under his control, that is a factor. Those combined elements would constitute a strategy that could enable the Ukrainians to win and to demonstrate that nuclear coercion does not work.
There is this perception or even public statements that the reason why Ukraine is not getting American long-range weapons is out of fear of escalation. We hear this word very often. How do you define it? What do you think the escalation means, especially in the context where a nuclear power is threatening a non-nuclear power with these weapons?
President Biden has been clear. President Trump was recently very clear that they fear that this war could escalate into a nuclear conflict. They're worried about doing something that would support Ukraine, that would provoke Russia into unleashing in some way a nuclear weapon. I think the threat is a serious one, but it's a manageable one. Again, this is a serious issue. You can't be flippant about this. And I think you can make a couple of assertions that are with a fair amount of degree of confidence. One, does it make sense for Putin to detonate a nuclear weapon on the very territory he claims is the heart of Russia? What will be the impact of such a detonation on the perceptions of the Russian people, who have a lot of relatives in Ukraine? What will be the battlefield impact of such a weapon? most military analysts and commanders that I talk to say it would be marginal. So you're not getting high military impact through the exercise of such a weapon. What would the impact be on Russia's allies and supporters? Probably distance them, because I don't think that his allies, so to speak, want to see that exercise. And then what risks would he be taking? What risks would he be catalyzing among his adversary, that is NATO allies? What is the risk that such an exercise of a nuclear weapon would provoke an even stronger response from the West? All these things lead me to believe that even Putin recognizes that an escalation of this sort is not to his own interests and would be counterproductive to his efforts to achieve his control over Ukraine.
What do you think they are thinking? What is President Xi thinking when Russia is coming out with nuclear threats? And the context in which I'm asking you this question is, how is China viewing proliferation of nuclear weapons in its own region? Let's say Japan acquires nuclear weapons, or South Korea, or some other regional countries.
I think China would like to see this war continue indefinitely. In a way, Russia is serving as kind of a guinea pig for the Chinese. For one, the Chinese get to observe how Russian tactics, Russian equipment, maybe even some of the equipment they use, operate against NATO forces, against their primary adversary. They get to see how Western military equipment performs, their weaknesses, their performance parameters, where they're effective, where they're not. They get to observe and watch what's effective against those systems and what's not. Second, they get to see Allied inventories get drawn down, get emptied, leaving the United States, leaving Europe and its allies perhaps less militarily robust because of the costs of this war. Icing on the cake is they get to see Russia weakened by this, because I wouldn't consider any strategic partnership between two authoritarian states to be a truly stable one. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union is a good example of that. I'm not sure this is too different what we see between Russia and China. So weaker Russia is to Xi's advantage, and that's what this war is doing to Russia. It's not strengthening it; it's burning out the Russian military. I suspect, I don't know for sure, but there's indications the Chinese may have communicated to Putin that we don't support the use of a Russian nuclear weapon in this conflict. Probably for exactly the same reason you pointed out, that would have a proliferation dynamic that could be contrary to Xi's own interest, to China's interest. If nuclear weapons were to become a part of this this conflict, well, it's likely that other countries go, wow, we need to urgently get this. And you would have a nuclear South Korea, or perhaps others in the region that might go that direction out of fear of Chinese aggression. So that wouldn't be to Xi's interests.
Thank you very much for this. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.